The Dark Scrolls. They called him a chosen companion, a boy lifted from obscurity to serve beside a lord, but no one ever asked him whether he wanted the honor. In the candlelit chambers of a daimyo's palace, he was not a name. He was an ornament, a ritual, a possession dressed in silk. And long before he understood the rules of his new life, he understood this much. Everything he had once been would be stripped away. His story was not unique. Across centuries of feudal Japan, countless boys were selected for a role both revered and feared, a position sometimes praised as a sacred bond, and other times whispered about as a form of gilded enslavement. They were called wakashu, adolescent males who became the intimate companions of powerful men. Officially, their presence was explained in terms of mentorship and aesthetic cultivation. The practice was cloaked in the language of refinement, arts, poetry, the pursuit of spiritual balance. But beneath the ceremony lay something far simpler and more brutal. The boy was expected to surrender his body, his will, and eventually any claim to a life beyond the walls that confined him. He was 12 years old when the summons arrived. His father, a lesser samurai fallen on hard times, received a scroll embossed with the seal of the daimyo's steward. The message was brief. The lord's household required a page of suitable beauty and decorum. Service was to be considered a privilege. Refusal was unthinkable. His mother wept when they cut his hair to the style appropriate for youth in courtly attendance, shaven at the front, long at the back. She wept again when she sewed the garments he would wear for the journey. In her mind, she was sending her child to a place of opportunity. But part of her understood, even then, that the walls of a great house could be as merciless as any battlefield. The road to the castle wound through harvested fields and small villages, where peasants paused in their labor to stare. At the gate, armored guards inspected the letter and waved him through without a word. He did not know that he would not see his family again for many years. He did not yet realize that the first night inside those walls would mark a threshold he could never cross back. Inside, he was led past courtyards of raked gravel and lacquered pavilions to a smaller compound reserved for attendants. Servants bathed him, dressed him in fresh robes, and instructed him in the patterns of deference. How low to bow, when to speak, when to remain silent. He was told that in the Lord's presence, he must never lift his gaze without permission. That evening he was presented in a long hall, lit by dozens of standing lamps. The daimyo reclined on a dais at the far end, surrounded by advisors and favored retainers. The boy tried to remember each rule, to keep his face composed. But when the Lord's gaze fell on him, something in his chest seemed to contract. "Bring him closer," the daimyo commanded, in a voice so soft it barely carried. A steward guided the boy forward until he stood at the edge of the dais. He sensed the attention of every man in the hall, felt the invisible weight of their curiosity and judgment. The Lord gestured, and the steward turned to the boy. "You will serve him," he said quietly. "You will honor this house. Your conduct will be an example." The boy bowed so low his forehead touched the polished floor. He felt the smooth grain of the wood against his skin. In that position he heard the Lord's voice again, almost contemplative. "He is pleasing. See that he is trained properly." Those words were the closest thing to a welcome he would receive. From that moment he ceased to be simply a servant. He had entered a role older than any law, a concubine in all but name, though in public the word was never spoken. For days he was instructed in the etiquette of presentation, how to walk without noise, how to arrange his hands in his lap, how to keep his face serene when addressed. Older attendants corrected him constantly, their voices never raised but always edged with censure. At night he lay awake in a narrow chamber shared with 3 other boys chosen for the same purpose. He listened to the wind against the screens and wondered when he would be sent home. It did not occur to him that the idea of home no longer applied. His first private summons came in the 2nd week. 2 retainers arrived in the evening, carrying a folded robe of crimson silk. They instructed him to bathe again and dress himself in the robe. He tried to ask why, but the words died in his throat. They led him down a corridor lined with carved panels depicting cranes and waves. At the end was a lacquered door he had never passed before. One retainer slid it open and he stepped inside. The chamber beyond was warm with lamplight and the smell of incense. The daimyo sat alone on a raised platform, dressed in informal robes. The boy knelt, pressing his forehead to the floor. "Look at me," the Lord commanded. He lifted his head. The daimyo's expression was unreadable. For a long moment he simply studied the boy's face, as if appraising a piece of calligraphy for flaws invisible to others. "You will serve tonight," he said. "You will not speak unless I permit it." The boy swallowed. He felt the air leave his lungs in a tremor he could not suppress. But he nodded. He had no other choice. That night passed in a haze of confusion and dread. What was demanded of him was framed as a ritual of devotion, an offering that sanctified his place in the household. But to the boy it felt like the erasure of everything he had been before. In the morning he was returned to the attendants' quarters. No one asked him what had happened. No one needed to. Over time, the pattern became routine. Summons would arrive without warning. He would be cleaned, dressed, instructed. In public, he was a silent figure behind the Lord's seat, a symbol of refinement. In private, he was something else entirely. The other boys learned quickly never to speak of these visits. There was no safety in confession. The walls heard everything, and any complaint was treated as ingratitude. They were reminded that this service was an honor beyond measure, that to be chosen was proof of divine favor. Some nights he believed it. Some nights he repeated the words in his mind like a prayer, trying to convince himself that the suffering had purpose. Other nights, when sleep would not come, he wondered if he had been chosen simply because no one would care enough to protect him. Months passed. He learned the rituals of the household with a precision born of fear. He learned to keep his eyes lowered, to hide every flicker of dread. He learned that the daimyo's moods could shift without warning, from cold detachment to a kind of possessive warmth that was almost worse. The seasons turned. Plum blossoms fell from the trees in the inner courtyard. The boy was no longer the newest arrival. Another child came, even smaller and more bewildered than he had once been. When the older attendants showed him how to kneel and bow, the boy realized that he had become part of the machinery that had consumed him. It was a knowledge that tasted like ash. Yet, in the eyes of the household, he was fulfilling his role perfectly. He was quiet, graceful, obedient. He was, in every visible way, exactly what the daimyo required. No one asked what price he paid to be so flawless. No one ever would. By the second year of his service, he had learned that the most dangerous thing he could possess was hope. Hope tempted him to imagine escape or rescue. Hope suggested that somewhere beyond the high walls and lacquered doors, there might still be a version of his life untainted by the demands of the daimyo's favor. He trained himself to let go of such thoughts. Each day began before sunrise. The boys were roused in darkness to prepare the Lord's garments and assemble the trays for the first meal. They moved in practiced silence, their faces expressionless. Even the youngest among them understood that to show emotion was to invite punishment. On ceremonial days, he would stand beside the daimyo's chair while guests, lords, monks, emissaries, filed into the great hall. He never looked up. He could only feel their scrutiny, the curiosity that always flickered across their eyes. Everyone knew why he was there. It was an open secret, spoken about in low voices or carefully phrased euphemisms, the boy chosen for the Lord's private company. He felt the shame like a bruise beneath his ribs, but he also understood that shame was a luxury he could no longer afford. It was during one of these gatherings that he first saw the monk. The man was older than most visitors, stooped and wrapped in robes the color of ash. His face was lined, his expression unreadable. But when he passed close to where the boy knelt, he slowed just enough to murmur, "Endure." One word, nothing more. It was the first kindness he had received since his arrival. He almost flinched, afraid that someone else had heard. But when he lifted his eyes a fraction, the monk had already moved on. Afterward, he replayed that moment in his mind until it blurred into something close to a prayer. The daimyo's attention, which had once seemed constant, became more unpredictable as the months wore on. Sometimes weeks would pass without a summons. Other times he would be called night after night, made to sit beside the Lord's bedding while poems were recited or to endure long hours of silence while the daimyo watched him, saying nothing. The boy learned to interpret small cues, the angle of a gesture, the softness or sharpness in a single word. These signals told him whether the evening would end in mere discomfort or something worse. He never knew which possibility he dreaded more. There were other boys in the household, each chosen for the same role. They were not friends in any meaningful sense. Trust was too dangerous. But there was a silent understanding among them, a recognition that none of them had chosen this. Late at night, after the lamps were extinguished, he sometimes listened to their breathing in the dark. The smallest sounds, a muffled sob, a shudder, were reminders that he was not alone in his fear. One evening he was summoned to assist with a new ceremony. The daimyo had acquired an heirloom, a lacquered screen depicting the 8 immortals crossing the sea. A feast was held to display it to visiting dignitaries. The boy was dressed in white silk and instructed to stand at the side of the screen, motionless, holding a fan inscribed with poetry. Hours passed. The air grew stifling with incense and sake. The daimyo, seated before his guests, gestured toward the boy. "Observe," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "Even a child can learn devotion." The guests murmured politely, but he could feel their eyes. In that moment he understood that he was not simply a servant or a concubine. He was a demonstration, a living testament to the Lord's power to shape a life until nothing remained but obedience. When the feast ended, he was dismissed without acknowledgement. In the corridor outside, his hands shook so badly that he nearly dropped the fan. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. For the first time he allowed himself to remember his mother's face, not as a blurred impression, but in detail. The curve of her cheek, the way her hands had trembled when she pressed his hair flat before he left. He wondered if she still believed he was fortunate. Winter came early that year. Snow drifted against the shutters, muffling every sound. In the cold, the routine took on an even more surreal quality. He learned to ignore the ache in his joints, the numbness in his hands. He learned to keep his mind blank when the daimyo's hand fell on his shoulder. Sometimes, in those long hours, he felt as though he had ceased to be a person at all. He was an object, beautiful when arranged correctly, silent when not in use. But even objects break. One night, as he was dressing to answer another summons, he found himself unable to move. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring. For a moment he thought he might collapse. An older attendant, a boy who had served the daimyo for nearly 6 years, watched him without expression. When the boy failed to rise, the older one crossed the room and crouched beside him. "Listen to me," the older boy whispered. "You must go. If you refuse, you will be beaten." "I can't," he whispered back, his voice hoarse. "You can," the other insisted, "because if you don't, it will be worse." He closed his eyes. He wished absurdly that the floor would open beneath him and swallow him whole. But when he opened them again, he forced himself to stand. The older boy nodded once, then stepped back to his place. It was a small act of mercy, so small it might have seemed meaningless. But in that moment, it saved him. When he entered the daimyo's chamber, he felt nothing, not fear, not shame, just a hollow resignation that was almost peaceful. He did not know that this numbness was its own kind of survival. The months blurred together. The seasons shifted. Cherry blossoms, monsoons, then rain, then the oppressive heat of summer. He grew taller. His voice deepened. The younger boys watched him the way he had once watched those before him, with a mixture of curiosity and dread. On the night of his 15th birthday, he was summoned once again. This time, the daimyo spoke more than usual. He poured sake into a lacquered cup and offered it with a faint smile. "You have served well," the Lord said. "Many boys do not last as long." He took the cup in hands that did not tremble. He drank because it was expected. The daimyo regarded him for a long moment. "You are no longer a child," he said finally. "Soon your place here will change." The boy did not ask what that meant. He already knew. As he grew older, his usefulness would fade. In time, another boy would be chosen and he would be displaced, transferred to a lesser role, or sent away altogether. It was not freedom. It was simply another kind of captivity. That night, when he returned to his quarters, he found a new child had arrived, barely 12, with wide eyes and a tentative bow. Their gazes met, one full of questions, the other empty of answers. For the first time, he understood what the older boys must have felt when they watched him kneel for the first time, a recognition that the cycle would never end. He did not know whether that thought was more comforting or more terrifying. Spring returned in a hush of falling petals and soft rains that seeped through the tile roofs. In the mornings he could smell the wet earth when he carried trays to the daimyo's antechamber. Everything looked deceptively peaceful, as if nothing beneath the surface had ever shifted. But he had learned by then that serenity in a great house was almost always an illusion. He was 16 when his summons changed in tone. No longer was he called nightly. The daimyo's attention had turned to the newest arrival, a boy delicate as a reed with the same startled look he once wore. The older attendants whispered that this was the natural order. Youth replaced youth, beauty replaced beauty, and no one lingered in the same role forever. But in the small hours when he lay awake listening to the hush of the corridors, he felt something colder than relief. He felt expendable. The first time he was ordered to instruct the new boy in ceremony, he hesitated. The child knelt before him with trembling hands. For a moment he almost reached out to offer comfort, but the habit of survival was stronger. He recited the instructions in a flat voice, careful not to look into the boy's eyes. When the lesson ended, he rose and left without another word. He told himself it was kindness, not cowardice, that the less the boy hoped for sympathy, the easier it would be to endure. But he knew the truth. He was no different from the older boys who had trained him, passing down a quiet, necessary cruelty that made life inside the walls bearable. Over the next months, his duties shifted. He still served the daimyo in public, still attended the ceremonies, still stood behind the Lord's seat. But the private summons came less often. He began to assist with household records and deliveries. These new tasks, though tedious, felt almost like a reprieve. Sometimes, when the daimyo's attention was fixed elsewhere, he could almost imagine he had regained a sliver of autonomy, but it was an illusion. He was still owned. His name was still spoken only as a function of the Lord's needs. One afternoon he was called to deliver a scroll to the steward's quarters. On his way through the garden, he passed the monk he had seen years before, the one who had whispered a single word, "Endure." The monk paused as their paths crossed. For a moment they regarded each other in silence. Then the monk inclined his head, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement. The boy, no, not a boy any longer, returned the bow. He felt something stir in his chest, an echo of the self he had nearly forgotten. That night he thought about how much had changed. The child who had arrived, trembling and bewildered, was gone. In his place stood someone harder, quieter, but not yet entirely hollow. The next season brought word that the daimyo would soon travel to the capital. Preparations consumed the household. Robes were inventoried, lacquer boxes packed, retainers dispatched ahead. For him, the announcement came with an unspoken understanding. When the lord departed, he would remain behind to oversee a part of the estate. It was not freedom, but it was distance. On the morning of the departure, he stood among the assembled servants as the daimyo emerged in traveling robes. The lord's gaze swept over the gathered faces. For an instant their eyes met. There was no acknowledgement, no farewell, just the familiar cold appraisal that had once terrified him. When the procession vanished beyond the gates, the courtyard fell into uneasy quiet. He remained standing long after the others had returned to their duties. He realized he felt nothing, no sorrow, no triumph, just the pale, clean emptiness of survival. In the months that followed, he learned to navigate this new existence. He managed inventories, settled disputes among lesser servants, oversaw the maintenance of the estate's outer buildings. These were tasks no one else wanted, but he performed them with the same unblinking precision he had learned in more intimate service. Some nights he walked the perimeter of the compound alone. He would pause beneath the trees and listen to the wind moving through the branches. For a few heartbeats, he could pretend he was simply another man, a caretaker, not a relic of someone's appetite. One evening, as he inspected the storehouse ledgers, the new boy approached, hesitating at the threshold. He looked smaller in the dim light, more fragile than he had appeared in the bright halls. "Forgive me," the child said, voice shaking. "I don't understand. How to make it easier?" For a long moment he did not answer. Then he closed the ledger and rose from his seat. "You can't," he said quietly. "You can only learn to feel less." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he did not cry. He only nodded. In that instant, he saw himself reflected in that small, bowed figure. He felt an ache so sudden it left him breathless. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He did not wait for a reply. After that night, he found that his days passed more swiftly. Routine was a balm. The absence of the daimyo's gaze was a relief deeper than he had dared imagine. But freedom, when it came, was not the deliverance he expected. A year after the daimyo's departure, the old lord died suddenly while traveling. The news arrived in a formal letter, sealed in black wax. No ceremony accompanied the reading, just the steward's flat recitation of the facts. For a moment he felt as though the ground beneath his feet had vanished. He had spent so long orbiting that singular gravity that he did not know how to stand without it. But when he looked around the chamber, at the other attendants, the scribes, the junior stewards, he saw no grief, only the quiet, weary relief of people who had survived something unspeakable. The household began to dissolve. Some retainers departed for other lords, some simply vanished. The boys who remained were reassigned or sent home. He was summoned to the steward's chamber one last time. The man regarded him with a look that was almost pity. "You have fulfilled your obligations," the steward said. "You are free to return to your family." Return. The word sounded foreign in his ears. He had not thought of home in so long that it felt like a place invented in a dream. When he stepped through the gates the next morning, carrying nothing but a small bundle of clothes, he paused on the threshold. The road beyond was bright with spring sunlight. He squinted against the glare, feeling something shift in the hollow space where fear had once lived. Freedom, he discovered, was not a single moment. It was the slow, bewildering process of remembering how to belong to oneself. He did not know what waited at the end of the road. He only knew that for the first time since he was 12 years old, no one could command where he went. He began to walk. Each step felt unsteady, like learning to stand again, but as the gates receded behind him, he did not look back. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.